Hello everyone, my name is Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute. Welcome to what I'm going to call Preston's Ponderings. I've been invited many times by friends to join YouTube, so hey, here I am. I hope you'll enjoy my segments as I share with you my thoughts on the last days, the topic of eschatology, to use the fancy term. And I just want to get right into this. I want to share with you some thoughts on what C.S. Lewis, a great Christian philosopher of the last generation, calls some of the most embarrassing words of Jesus. Scholars have been perplexed, Bible students have been perplexed by Jesus' statements that he was coming in judgment in the lifetime of the first century audience. Skeptics of the Bible say, see, Jesus said he was coming back on the clouds of heaven with the angels and flaming fire in the first century. He didn't do it. See, he's not the Son of God. Well, on Preston's Ponderings, I hope to share with you some solutions to these problems, to these challenges of Christianity. So we want to begin with Matthew 16, 27 and 28. Jesus said, "The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and shall reward every man according to his works. Verily I say unto you, there are some standing here that shall not taste of death until they have seen the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Now let me ask you, do we have any 2,000-year-old people running around today? Well, pretty clearly not. But you know, you'd be amazed at the number of different explanations, some of them really quite desperate, to try to explain away or to try to explain these critical verses from Jesus' teaching. Now, just for information's sake, I've written a little book entitled, "Can You Believe Jesus Said This?" I've also written a larger book entitled, "Like Father, Like Son, on Clouds of Glory." And in that book, which is, by the way, over 400 pages, or over 300 pages, I go into great detail explaining these verses. But here on Preston's Ponderings, we're just going to deal with short thoughts, brief thoughts, to try to share with you a few things to help us come to an understanding of Jesus' statements. Here are just a few of the things and a few of the concepts that we're going to develop and examine as we look at Matthew 16, 27, and 28. We're going to look at the prophetic source and fountain of Matthew 16, 27, and 28. We are going to examine the unity, the grammatical unity between verse 27 and 28. Do you realize that one of the most common efforts to explain these verses away is the argument that, hey, verse 27 is talking about the end of the world. Verse 28 is the day of Pentecost, or some combination thereof. We're going to be examining these verses to show that Jesus was predicting his coming in the vindication of his own suffering and the suffering of his disciples. It's right there in the text. We're going to be demonstrating that the prediction of Jesus' coming in judgment was, in fact, the same thing as the prediction of his coming in his kingdom. Many tried to delineate between those concepts, but we're going to show that they are, in fact, the same identical motifs. Well, we're going to be addressing the questions such as, was Matthew 16:28 fulfilled on the day of Pentecost? Or was Matthew 16:27 and 28 fulfilled in visionary form on the mountain of transfiguration just 6 days later? Does that meet the criteria of fulfillment for Jesus' statement, "Some standing here shall not taste of death until they have seen the Son of Man coming in his kingdom"? And we're going to be doing some great comparative studies between Matthew 16, 27 and 28, Matthew 24, and Matthew chapter 25. You're going to be amazed at the things that I'm going to share with you. And of course, I'm going to be sharing with you a comparative study between what Jesus predicted in Matthew 16, 27 and 28 and what he said in the book of Revelation. Yes, what he said, as well as what John wrote in the book of Revelation. Now, hey, we're going to be looking at a lot of other topics as well, and themes that are all found right here in Matthew 16, 27, and 28. For the time being, however, I would like to introduce one really critical thought. And that is that Jesus' prediction, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and shall reward every man according as his work shall be. Do you realize that Jesus was simply reiterating Old Testament prophecies of the coming of Messiah in judgment to establish the kingdom? Now, why is that important? Well, it's tremendously important. But you see, first of all, we have to establish that fact. Paul said in Romans chapter 15, verse 8, that he testified, in other words, he affirmed in the strongest manner, that Jesus Christ became the servant to the circumcision, to Israel, to confirm the promises made to the fathers. In other words, Jesus' entire ministry, Jesus' mission, was to confirm and to fulfill the promises that God made to Old Covenant Israel. Now, I'm going to say something right here, and if you haven't heard this before, it may be rather shocking, it may be rather challenging, but in the ensuing segments, in the ensuing lessons, you're going to see that this is absolutely true. All New Testament prophecies of the end of the age, the coming of the Lord, the resurrection, and the judgment, are simply reiterations of Old Testament prophecies of the coming of the Lord, judgment, and the resurrection and the kingdom. There are no, quote, new prophecies of eschatology. There are New Testament citations of, reiterations of, Old Covenant prophecies of the coming of the Lord in judgment and the kingdom, because the New Testament writers tell us over and over again that their one hope, their hope of the resurrection, their hope of the coming of the Lord, was nothing different from the Old Covenant promises made to Israel. Now, very quickly, in the time left in this first segment, I'd like to call your attention to two passages from which Jesus is drawing. The first passage is Isaiah chapter 40. What we find in Isaiah chapter 40 is, behold, the Lord your God shall come with a strong hand, and his arm shall rule for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his work before him. Sound familiar? Well, of course it does. It's Matthew 16:27. Now, it's critical to note right here that this coming of the Lord would come after the voice of one crying in the wilderness, saying, prepare the way of the Lord. So Matthew 16:27 would be the fulfillment of Isaiah 40. But it would also be the prediction or the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 62, which said, behold, the Lord has proclaimed to the end of the world, say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your salvation is coming. Behold, his reward is with him, and his work before him. Once again, sound familiar? Well, of course it does. You see, the significant thing about this passage is that it predicted the remarriage of God with Israel. In the last days, God had been married to Israel. God divorced Israel, but he would remarry Israel. Now, no one doubts that Matthew 16:27 is a prediction of the coming of the Lord for his wedding, right? Unfortunately, many try to make the coming of Jesus at the time of the wedding something totally different from what the Old Testament predicted, but it's not. It's the same thing. This has incredible implications for our understanding of the time and the nature and the framework of the fulfillment of Matthew 16:27 and 28. My goodness, look at the time. Already out of time for this segment. Hey, thanks for joining us here on the introduction to Preston's Ponderings. We'll see you in the next segment, so stay tuned for it.